By now, you should be used to the fact that economists like to categorize things. And with inflation, we need to look into what causes the inflation. And that's how we break down inflation. We look at first demand pull inflation. Inflation that is caused when the demand for goods is greater than the supply of goods would be considered demand pull inflation, right? Mentioned earlier about the hand sanitizer. Here's a case where the demand for goods is greater than the supply of the goods, so the price of the good is going up. Now, if that were to set off inflation in the country, we could see that this would be demand pull inflation. Knowing that the demand for goods is greater than the supply of goods set off the inflation, then we could figure out how to fix it. Deal with the demand, deal with supply. Okay? Now, the other type of inflation that we face is cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is inflation caused when the cost of production goes up. In 1973, the United States saw an embargo of oil by OPEC, and that caused the price of oil in the United States to jump from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel, a quadrupling of the price of crude oil, which then set off a rippling effect, increasing the price of gasoline. And since gasoline is an input into the production of everything, because everything eventually gets into a truck, it caused inflation in the country. And so that was cost push inflation. And we knew then, by figuring out which type of inflation we had, then we could figure out what needed to be done about it. But before we can figure out what we've got to do about it, we need to figure out how bad inflation is. When we're talking about how bad inflation is, what we're talking about is measure the degree of inflation. Now, there are two ways of measuring inflation. The first is to measure what we call the producer price index, using the producer price index. The producer price index measures inflation at the producer level. So, how much are inputs into production increasing? The producer price index is not something you usually hear quoted on the news, but it's a very important measure of inflation because the producer price index gives us a very good foreshadowing of what inflation on the consumer level is going to be. If we have inflation at 3% on the producer level, we can pretty much be certain that inflation is going to be at 3% or more at the consumer level. There's usually a 2 to 3 month lag between a change in the producer price index and a change in the other measure, which is the consumer price index. The CPI measures changes in prices at the consumer level, the level that you and I pay. So if the producer price level changes by 2%, you and I are pretty much guaranteed that 2 to 3 months down the road, our consumer prices are going to increase. Now, once we know how much inflation is, what's going on with inflation, we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. Now, when I think of inflation, I think of a train running out of control. You know, those old westerns where somebody kills the engineer of the train. The train is now picking up speed. It is going down a mountain and it needs to make a turn up ahead, but there's nobody in the cab of the train, and so we can see the train picking up speed and moving down the tracks. What do we need to do to save the train and all the people on the train? We need to put the brakes on the train. And so when you're trying to take this train under control, how do you cope with inflation? Well, just like with trying to get the train under control, you've got to put the brakes on. The government needs to put the brakes on the economy. And there are different ways that the government can do that. If you think of the components of GDP being consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Let's leave net exports out of this for a while. How do we change consumption? How do we change investment? How do we change government spending? Well, to get consumers and businesses to spend less, we could very simply tax them more or increase interest rates on savings so that they save more. All right. Probably not good things to try to do during a period of inflation. People are being hurt already. Taxing them more is not a good idea. Interest rates are already going up, but those are interest rates that you pay on loans. It's not interest rates to get you to save more, although those would probably be going up also. But we don't want to hold money. Money is losing value. We want to get rid of it. So savings isn't going to work. The government could, and probably the quickest way to deal with this is for the government to stop spending money. Something that's very hard for the government to do. But what do you stop spending it on? That becomes a problem because the government, once it starts programs, has a constituency of people who are getting helped by that program. So that's tough. Now, we could try wage price controls. Wage price controls is when the government freezes wages and prices at their current level. The logic with this is if wages and prices are frozen, then that should force businesses to take a look at the true costs of production in order to determine whether or not the price they're selling their good for is a good price, whether they're making money on it. Now, this may sound funny, but during a period of really bad inflation, not only are the prices to consumers going up rapidly, but also the prices to producers are going up rapidly. And so producers really don't, after a while, really aren't certain of what it costs them to produce their goods. They're just raising the price that they sell it to the consumer for. Think about if you own a store and prices are going up rapidly. You keep changing the price of a can of tuna on the shelf. You can't remember what it really cost you to buy that can of tuna. But you know that the price of everything else is going up, so you got to keep raising that price of that can of tuna. Producers are the same way. They can't keep track of all of the prices of their inputs, especially when they're going up quickly. So the idea of a wage price control is to freeze all wages and prices at their current level, give producers a chance to figure out what it's actually costing them, and then for them to realize that hopefully the price they're currently selling the good for is a good price, that they can make a profit. If you leave the wage price controls on for a long enough period of time to force businesses to do that, the logic is that when you remove the wage price controls, you won't see inflation again. Businesses are not going to be stampeding to raise the price of their good. Well, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You need to leave the wage price controls on for a fairly good length of time. In the 1970s, they only left it on for 60 days, not long enough. Businesses actually spent more time trying to figure out how to get around the wage price controls during that time period, and as soon as the wage price controls were lifted, prices jumped up again. All right. So leave them on. If you find yourself in the position of a government, being in the government, tell people the wage price controls are permanent. You know they're not going to be, but tell them they're going to be on at least a year, year and a half. And then that'll force businesses to look at their true costs of production, because they're going to want to make a profit, and they're going to want to make a profit as quickly as they can. So they'll figure it out. The other option for the government is to do what we call a rifle shot policy. And what this means is the government steps in and picks a certain industry. This tends to be an industry which has a lot of consumers, it has a lot of firms inputting into them. It's a good, what we call a feeder industry. And what happens here is the government goes to an industry, for example, goes to GM and says to GM, okay, we're here to help you get your wages and prices under control. So the government will go with GM as it negotiates with the unions to keep wage increases reasonable. It'll go with GM to talk to its tire supplier and try to keep the cost of tires low. The whole idea here is by putting the strength of the government with the company, you can then get wages and prices under control so that once GM has its prices under control, the price of cars will stabilize. Then the hope is that will have a rippling effect throughout the economy. Again, you do this with a couple of major industries, you can affect the economy. Now, the next thing the government has to be careful of is the fact that we are trying to contract the economy. And contracting the economy means we're going to create unemployment. And so in our next lecture, we're going to look at something called the Phillips curve. And that looks at the relationship between inflation and unemployment.